Okay, super. Well, I'm going to go ahead and get started because once again, we've got a class that's full of information. So this week and next week, we're talking about Silverpoint. And the way I want to do this, because this is not a really familiar medium to an awful lot of people, is I'm going to spend more time this week talking about the how. And showing examples. We will get some opportunity to draw, but it'll be mostly on the information, with the idea that next week we will be spending almost all the time on drawing and trying to refine some of the technique. So just to start off, let me say thank you once again to the Vineyard Haven Public Library and to Anne, because we are now more than halfway through the summer, which means in terms of my imaginary trip that I told you about in those early classes when we're going from here to South Dakota, we're just out of Chicago right now and we're heading for the plains. So what that means is we've now covered really all the major sort of areas of drawing medium that we're going to talk about this summer. And now we're going to be applying the various different drawing media to whatever it is, whatever subject matter it is that we're drawing. And so today, the Silverpoint is sort of a bridge to that. We'll be pulling in some technique information that we've already learned about, but looking at it in terms of this particular historic sort of drawing media. So I'm not expecting that most people have Silverpoint tools just sort of hanging around. So today, if you're planning on just drawing along with pencil on paper, that is perfectly fine. All you need is white paper and some sharp pencils. And I emphasize sharp. And if you have options in your pencils, if you have some that are softer and some that are harder, today is the day to use the harder pencils, the hardest pencils you have, like a 2H or an F or an H, because those will most closely emulate what happens with Silverpoint. And I'll explain more as we go along. But just, if you've got those materials ready, that's great. If you don't have anything but just a regular household pencil, just sharpen it well and use it kind of lightly to get the same sorts of strokes that you'll see. So to talk about Silverpoint a little bit, this is a medium that was very popular hundreds of years ago and then sort of died out of popularity and most recently has become popular again. And people are enchanted by the name Silverpoint. It sounds exciting. But as I had read somewhere a while ago, this was talking about travel, but I think it applies here, that the exotic is often a function of distance and ignorance. So as exotic as the idea of Silverpoint sounds, it's not necessarily inexpensive to get yourself started with a very extensive range of Silverpoint tools. So it's good to start either with pencil or with just a simple stylus and a prepared ground that has already been made. And if you haven't already got a materials list, I had a PDF that I put out earlier. It's not a buy this list. It's Elizabeth's favorite materials list. And there's a copy of it on the art classes pages on my website, or you can email me, erwhelan@gmail.com, and I can send you a copy. So if you do decide you want to purchase some Silverpoint materials, this will give you a way to not be out there just sort of, spending at large. At the same time, I think that there's a lot of wonderful work that can be done with Silverpoint, and I'm glad to see it coming back into style. We're going to learn today a little bit about what you can do with it, what the limitations are, and sort of how to enjoy everything that is about Silverpoint. So let me go ahead and get started. Welcome back to Summer of Drawing, and here we are in class number 11, talking about Silverpoint. And I just want to give you guys an overview, a bit of a history, so you sort of know what we're talking about. Silverpoint is a Silverpoint drawing is made by dragging a silver rod or wire across a surface, which is often prepared with gesso and primer. The idea basically is that you need to get the flakes of silver onto the paper, and a prepared paper allows that to happen. If you use a Silverpoint on a regular paper, it just sort of slides across, nothing goes on. So Silverpoint is one of several types of metal point used by scribes, craftsmen, and artists for hundreds of years. Metal point styli were used for all sorts of writing, and the essential metals that were used were lead, tin, and silver. So very interesting and pertinent to what we'll be doing next week is the fact that goldsmiths also used metal point drawings to prepare their detailed drawings. And here's an example right over here. So if you were a goldsmith and you were doing a design, you needed it to be approved by your client, you would do your drawing using metal point, often silver point, to give them an idea of exactly how you were going to go about it. And here's an example right here, a design for a statuette by Hans Holbein the Elder. So then what happened is in the late Gothic and early Renaissance, silver point really sort of hit its heyday. This fine line drawing technique, people really liked the detail and the delicacy you could get with it. The silver didn't blunt as easily as lead or tin when it came to using the tip. So you could get this precise detail. And, you know, people like Leonardo, you can see his bear walking image right here, and they really loved it. It was very popular in Florence and also in the Flemish workshops. So some of the people who worked in silver point, Jan van Eyck, Leonardo da Vinci, Albrecht Dürer, and Raphael. But then what happened was somewhere around the end of the 1500s, drawing styles changed, and the artists were getting away from this super detail that we see right here. And more they wanted to have, you know, loose, more gestural drawings, and the chalks that we were working, the kind of thing we were working with last week actually, started to become more familiar. And also ink and wash drawings became more popular. You know, just as then as now, styles change and drawing styles change. And after one achieves a certain sort of level of excellence, it's time to try something else. So here we've got Hans Holbein the Younger, and this beautiful study, which actually pulls in, interestingly, some pencil and some red chalk. And this is where you often look through drawings from the 1500s, well, even 1400s and onwards, and you'll see that there's a combination of drawing media used. And this is something we're going to talk about in weeks to come, is putting different drawing media together. But in the meantime, you still had people, you know, you had Hendrik Goltzius, for example, and Rembrandt, still maintaining silver point traditions. This is a beautiful piece over here that Goltzius did. And also you had botanical artists. They really loved, you still see a lot of those beautiful drawings that were done from the 1600s that were done using silver point. But then you had people like Ingres, who had an incredibly detailed, very light style that would seem perfect for silver point. But he managed to start moving towards graphite. It was just that much easier to get. You could get a greater range of values. And even though he still was using that very fine technique, he could get darks and things that he had a hard time getting in silver point. So basically by the 1700s, silver point really wasn't being used. Wonderfully, there has recently been a real revival in using silver point. And I think it's just like letterpress and some of the other techniques, craft techniques. We managed to get ourselves away in very quick order in the 1990s and onwards with computer art and digital art. And all of that was really wonderful and still is. But for artists, it's not the feeling of craft. You know, it's not the same feeling as drawing, the same feeling as creating something. And even for printmakers, letterpress and all of that stuff is just really tactile. And so it's been wonderful to see this resurgence of the interest in drawing, and also with the idea of silver point. So there's a little bit of history. And now let's talk about the materials of silver point. So you actually don't need very much at all. Traditionally, there was some issues. You had to have the vellum, you had to have the particular traditional ground, which had to be, you know, ground up and made from scratch. Now we can get things like silver point drawing ground from Golden. And that's really what I'm going to be talking about mostly today, because it's the easiest thing to get. So this is I think a bottle costs about $13 or $14. It goes a long way. You can put that ground on lots and lots and lots of pieces of paper or board. And then you see that little black stylus in the middle of the image. That is from Cretacolor. And it's just a holder with a little piece of silver in it. And this is a really good way to get started with silver point. The holder that you see further down is if you're, you know, starting to invest a little bit more of your time and effort. That's a holder that you can put different types of metal wire in. And in this particular case, I've got silver, a thick lead in one end and a thin lead in the other. And then in the middle there, are erasers, because it is a myth that you can't erase silver point. The problem is is that you can't erase the ground. If you start erasing your lines and you take the ground off, then there's nothing for the silver to adhere to anymore. That's where the problem comes in. But it is possible, especially at the end of your drawing when you don't really care if all of that ground is there, to very carefully pick out some details, but you can't rely on it. When you do use one though, these white erasers, especially the white polymer erasers like the one from Alvin that I'm showing here, they're perfect. So if you are using different types of points, what would you use? So I'm not a representative for this company, but I did buy a kit that came with a number of different types of points. So I wanted to show them to you. So you can, as you can see here, there's wide yellow brass, a wide nickel silver, a thin copper, wide sterling silver and thin silver, which is what I've got in my holder. And then this other interesting item is bronze wool. So if you wanted to create a very, very soft, maybe a little bit of background or some shading or whatever, the bronze wool is light enough to create a very fine sort of misty feeling. And then you can do marks over the top. Now you can mix and match any of these metals together. You don't really see much of a difference when you're actually drawing. Some of them have a greater range of light and dark than others, but you do notice a difference over time. And when I say over time, I mean over years as they age, because some will age quickly and some won't. Copper, for example, will age pretty quickly. Silver, it can take a number of years. Gold doesn't at all. I don't have a gold point here. So I'm going to address this a little bit more later, but this whole idea of aging of silver point is one of the attractive features. And so I guess, in the interest of transparency, I would say to you that aging a drawing doesn't necessarily make it better. It makes it look older. So if you're after your drawing looking older, then the aging process will do that, but it will not turn your drawing into Leonardo's drawing. And I think it's important to stress that, because whether you're drawing with a pencil or charcoal or Conte or any of the things that we've done, it's about how your drawing is coming along, how your skills are developing, how your quality of line is looking. You'll get that, as I mentioned before, through practice and observation. And so one of the things in terms of observing that we're going to do today when we look at some art that was done hundreds of years ago is I want you to look for how they did it. Not so much is this a beautiful drawing, but how did they do that? Where did they draw in silver point and where did they not draw in silver point, and why? And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go. So grounds, the most important thing is you've got to be able to get that silver to come off your stylus and onto your support. So through the course of the summer, I've been introducing you to words like value and other technical terms. So here's another one, which is support. So a support is whatever you're drawing on. It's the board or the paper or the illustration board. And so traditionally, in order to get a ground onto your support, which back in the 1500s would have been vellum or maybe some rudimentary paper or a piece of wood, traditionally what you were using were things like chicken bones or other animal bones that were calcified, heated up to become a white powder, and those were then added to some mixture of glue, and all sorts of things were used as glue, everything from egg to animal glue, to whatever would adhere it to the support. So that was a bit of a process. And I wanted to sort of take a little detour for a second and talk a bit about what was going on in the 1500s in art. We have a tendency to think about people like, Michelangelo or Leonardo, working sort of individually in their studios or maybe having a workshop or whatever, because these are the names that we're most familiar with. But it's really important to remember that during this time, especially like in Florence and Rome and Paris, places like that, the arts were thriving. Now, of course, there wasn't the population that there are now, but there were many, many people, many goldsmiths, artists, people doing frescoes, people painting on things, mosaics, builders, architects, designers. So there were people who were supplying. You didn't necessarily always have to grind your own stuff, basically, is what I'm saying. But you would get from a supplier or somebody who was selling something in bulk a product that you still had to somehow mix into something else. So looking here at this picture, I've got what we're going to talk about today, which is the drawing ground that comes already mixed. Then I also have this bag of traditional Silverpoint ground. And I'm going to mix some of that up for next week and sort of show you how that's done. It's a little bit more time consuming, but it's not terrible. But once again, this is closer to the product that most artists who were professionals would have obtained from somebody. They wouldn't necessarily be mixing everything themselves from scratch. And then over here on the right, we have gouache and gum arabic. So there are many other different ways that people can put grounds together and make their own. And some people use gouache, sometimes adding this stuff called gum arabic to it to make it a little bit more of a toothy surface. Gum arabic is basically a resin from an acacia tree, and it's used a lot to add with pigment and water to make gouache and to make other types. I think even watercolor has gum arabic in it. So that's just sort of another material you can get. But there's no need to be arcane about all of this stuff. It's just fine to pick up a bottle of the ground and just go for it. So I went ahead and prepared a bunch of pages myself this last week and did some experimenting. I wanted to see what those materials I just showed you would do. And the first thing I'm going to tell you is that this is very light on your screen because that is exactly how light these marks are. And I didn't want to darken them, because it would give you the wrong impression about what Silverpoint can do. So over here on the upper left-hand corner, you have little examples I did in silver. Below that, I used some nickel. Down in the corner, I used the left-hand corner, I used the red brass that was thin. You can see how very light that is. In the middle at the bottom, I used the yellow brass, which is about the same darkness as the silver. Then copper wire in the middle, going up and down. And then over on the right, I've got copper wool at the top and then copper wool where I did some silver marking. The little white lines you see through some of these areas are where I took an eraser and erased. So because I wanted to show you that erasing can be done. Like I said, with that caveat, that once you take the ground off, it's going to be difficult to replace that. So you're not dealing with a great value range of light or dark. And definitely, I think if you're a person who is used to the regular range of pencil, silver is going to take a little getting used to. What I have done is I've done for myself a number of different drawings over the last week using the different wires, just because I'm curious to see what happens with them over time. But as I said, I don't expect, it's not as if, I'm going to put these away in a drawer and all of a sudden I'm going to open them up and they're going to be these wonderful museum quality drawings. No, that's not going to happen. But I was interested to see how the different wires act and also how the different substrates, the different supports that I'm putting the ground on, do they make a difference to how much silver comes off? So I've got some of those to show you in just a second. So just to reiterate this whole idea about values are, basically we're talking about percentages of dark running from white all the way to black. So mid-range value is about 50%. It's not super dark, not super light. So pencil has a really great range, as we know, but very difficult to get those super, super blacks. And that's where charcoal really excels. You can get the super blacks, but it's actually a little harder to control charcoal at the lighter end. There's a tendency for everything to get really dark. Pencil, you can do quite a range, but then Silverpoint, you cannot do quite a range. Silverpoint, the value range is extremely compressed. You're really talking about, what is dark, what is 100% if you're using charcoal is 40% with silver. So that is a little bit of getting used to. It I think is frustrating to people who have worked with more modern and contemporary materials to suddenly find out you can't really get those rich darks. How do you go about that? And that's where people mix media together and to try to get a little bit of everything. At the same time, the beauty of silver and its subtlety is something to be enjoyed in and of itself. And this is where even working with very light pencils, very hard pencils to sort of get the idea, the delicacy and control that you can get by just sort of resigning yourself to this compressed value scale, I think is extremely useful. If artists, especially beginning artists, are always relying on dark, on that dark charcoal and the dark pencil, to sort of give their drawings oomph, rather than on the quality of their line and, how they're shaping the form. I think it can lead to some frustration when the drawing doesn't come out looking of a quality that you might like. So that's why silver point and practicing, even just with hard pencils, I think is a good idea. So how light is light? Well, light is very light. And so I'm just going to run you through a number of examples really quickly, just so we can sort of see what we're talking about. This is an extremely light silver point. It was done in late 1800s probably. So we're talking something that is a couple of hundred years old, almost 130, 140 years old. Even in aging, it has become browner, but it has not become darker. And this is just sort of something I want to point out. At the same time, how lovely is this? So talking about the how, if you're looking at this, if you're watching today on a tiny screen, it might be a little bit difficult to see, but there is hatching around, for example, the bottom of the eyes, the bottom of the neck, around the bottom of the chin and the cheek, going in different directions to sort of create this feeling of round. So for anyone who has not either watched the earlier videos or been in the earlier classes, hatching is just basically a series of lines going in one direction, and cross hatching means you're coming back the other way with a similarly spaced series of lines. You can then take that further, by changing the directions and going in as many different directions that you need to when you're hatching to sort of build up darker areas rather than lighter areas. And when it comes to silver point, although you can sort of sketch and fill in an area, you don't really it's very difficult to sort of maintain the subtlety, especially if you're working on a rougher paper. So this idea of the hatching is really important. So something that we can see a little bit more easily on this screen is this beautiful Dürer drawing. Now, interestingly enough, this business about traces of carbon black, it means that what he did was he did a little bit of sketching in a carbon pencil of some form, whether it was a light charcoal or something, to work out where he was going to do the silver point before he started. If you do that, you can't necessarily, once again, erase your pencil like you normally would before you get started. But if you want something that's a little more comfortable to give you a few hints where you're going as you get started, that's something to do. But once again, this is all about direction of line, everything, all of that shading, the fur and such, just like when we were talking about organic forms. Silver point excels at this idea of the very subtle following of form. I wish I could had a more zoomed in version of this, because this beautiful shading that you see, this is a larger drawing, and it is done by tiny, tiny little bits of shading. But when I was talking earlier about having a look at these drawings and how did they do them, one of the things you'll notice about all of these is everything is not filled in. There are large areas where the paper is just the paper. Now, what we're looking at here looks like a toned paper, but back when this was done in the 1400s, this would have been as close to a white or a natural paper as possible. And so the silver has aged over time. It would have been gray on a whiter paper, and now it has this brown tone. And this is what people often want. They want to get this sort of aged look very quickly. And I'll show you a little bit later about an experiment I did try to make that happen. So here we have another Goldsmiths silver point, which is really lovely. They're not quite sure, whoever was looking at this, whether it was metal point or silver point. So metal point really refers to the whole gamut, including silver, but it could be bronze or any of those others. But once again, talking about what we always do with the no-tan idea about the light and the dark, that's really important in silver point, is having these big open areas like most of her face and the ruff around her neck and the book that are definitely different in terms of how much shading is going on. Now, in this particular case, the artist used a very, very, very light touch on her face. And then when he got out here to the clothing, things got a lot heavier and a lot darker. So there is an opportunity to get, to get rough. You don't have to necessarily, everything doesn't have to be delicate. And here's a good example of Rembrandt not being delicate. So this is great because this is sketching. I think another of the myths that has developed over time, especially in modern day, is that silver point has to be very sort of precious. You can't use it for this kind of sketching. But if you think about it, back in the day, there weren't a lot of different options for what materials you had to sketch with. So you sketched with whatever. Everything wasn't classified. Oh, you could only use silver point for a certain type of drawing. And that's what I like about this, because this would have been done with either a duller or a wider kind of tip, not the super fine ones. And he was not at all concerned about having this refined, beautiful image that was going to last 500 years. He was doing studies probably for a painting, and they were extremely immediate. So I think this is really useful to see, because one of the beauties of silver point is that you can put ground on some pages in a sketchbook. You can take your stylus and eraser and off you go. And you can be drawing at the market or drawing at the cafe or whatever using silver point. It doesn't require a lot of, mysticism to go along with it. At the same time, you can go crazy. You can go crazy on the subtleties. Is this not just gorgeous? So this was done in the end of the 1800s. Definitely part of that arts and crafts revival, the pre-Raphaelites, and that gorgeous look. And this was very, very carefully rendered and would have taken a long time to do. Notice how the lines are following the form of the hair. And on the face, even though the lines are really pretty directional, they're all sort of heading one way. At the same time, very, very subtle shading built up in certain places to get that feeling of form. And only going in with the darks where they were really needed. And so the darks would be requiring building up that area by passing over it time and time again until you got that deposit. So this kind of brown shade, such as you see here, is what you can expect of a silver point as it ages in terms of our lifetime. If you did some silver points this week and put them away, in a few years, you would start to see this sort of coloration. And I just wanted to throw in this because I thought this was lovely. The Artist's Bride of 3 Days. And this is a little detail that he did. And I just thought this was marvelous. It's actually not that small. I mean, it looks small here, but the page in general is large. He has his little notes at the bottom. But it was just really nicely done. And see how sketchy that is? So once again, don't feel when you draw that you have to do everything like that gorgeous example we just saw. This is equally lovely. And then moving into more modern time, Otto Dix did this just marvelous, marvelous silver point. And I like it because it is so contemporary. It's a contemporary drawing. He's just picked up a silver point rather than a pencil in order to do it. And this is definitely how I would like you to think about silver point, as a very approachable and easy to use drawing medium that has its limitations with value, but not with what you can draw. And this is, I'm not quite sure who drew this. I don't know why I don't have an attribution here, but I also wanted to show that it can be used for plein air. Somebody was out in the countryside with their sketchbook and drew this in silver point. So it is silver point and not just metal point. So, it can be used for whatever type of drawing you want to do. At the same time, I want to show you two contemporary artists whose work is just fabulous. And I'd like you to visit both of their websites. So Lauren Redding does really amazing work of astronauts, of people, of this, that, and the other. She works large size. Her detail is extraordinary. But one thing that I'd like to point out, and she mentions on her website, so this is why I want you to go to her website after the class at some point and have a look, is that she has to photograph these pictures in low light. The paper is actually white because of the reflective nature of silver. They really sort of, they work better in real life than they do trying to show you on a screen. So she's got some examples where you can see her detail much more closely. And what it takes for her to get this finish is extraordinary. I did managed to get a little bit of a detail just so you could see from another one of her images how she sort of builds up. And you can just imagine the amount of time this takes, but the incredible subtlety you get really is extraordinary. But I would really encourage you to visit her site if you're interested in particular in sketching and drawing people using Silverpoint. And plus, the way she, on her site, the various different subjects she has done enlarged, so you can see quite a bit of this detail. And then another person, the other person I'd like you to go and check out their website, because he does such incredible work, is Tom Mazzulo. I'm pretty sure I'm pronouncing his name correctly. He does much more, I would call them sparse subject matter on a blank background with incredible precision to his work, and just makes the most simple forms so beautiful. So this is an interesting example of a ribbon form, and I'm going to show you a detail from this. Look at that. When I talk about hatching and cross hatching, this is exactly what I'm talking about. So somebody like Tom takes that to the nth degree. You've got the Rembrandt sort of style where he was, sketching really loosely. Then you've got this extremely controlled cross hatching. Notice also how edges really are part of the form. So it's not like he's got big outlines everywhere. Obviously, he did draw himself some outlines so he could get himself started. But those outlines and the gradation build themselves into the form overall. And the subtlety is really incredible. But one of the things I like about Tom's work is that, it's really contemporary, isn't it? He's not trying to draw the way they did in the 1500s, even though he's using those same sorts of tools. And these types of exercises of looking at simple forms, but trying to get the values right so that they work in 3D, I think these are excellent sorts of exercises. Once again, look at that detail. And even the shading, the subtlety of the shading that's underneath there. Now, he is working on colored ground. What he's done is he's prepared his own surfaces, and he's just added a little bit. It could have been gouache or watercolor or a little bit of pigment. You can do many different ways to color your ground. If you try that, don't go too dark. Just keep it super light, like this one in the blue that you saw before. But you can definitely do that to add a little bit more interest. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to play a little video and show it, and I'm going to narrate it. So I'm going to show what I was doing preparing some grounds. It is so simple. You're going to look at this and go, wow, I can do this, no problem. Let me order a bottle of Golden's Ground. One thing I will mention, I didn't show you the entire shaking of the bottle process, but the bottle needs to be shaken well. So it's just as if you had an old little bottle of nail polish or an old can of spray paint, and there's a ball bearing in there, a couple of ball bearings, and you need to shake the bottle until you hear those things move freely. And don't skimp on that, or the mixture won't come out properly. So take the minute or whatever it takes to really make sure you're hearing those ball bearings rattle around, and you'll be good to go. So here we go. There's the abbreviated version. So you can apply more than one coat if you feel like it. I found one coat was fine. It says clean up with soap and water, but I did find that this stuff it's hard to get off. Not so much on your hands, but I also kept the top closed as much as I possibly could. So there I'm exiting stage left to get a paper towel. But cleanup is relatively easy, but I put down some craft paper underneath just so I wouldn't get the stuff everywhere. The instructions say that you should put some out like in a little bowl and let it sit for 5 minutes before you start. I was impatient and decided, well, what if I don't do that? And so what I did was I just squirted a little bit at a time where I need it. What you're trying to do with that sitting is avoid bubbles. But I found by using a halfway decent brush, I didn't have any bubbles. It wasn't a problem. And actually, I was able to not waste material by doing this. So I've got a small sketchbook here with heavy watercolor paper in it. It's a watercolor, it's for watercolorists. So this isn't just sort of like a regular sketchbook with regular paper in it, because that would buckle too much. And what I did was I prepared, just by painting back and forth, this ground in a nice layer. over numerous sheets of paper that I then let sit overnight. So here I've got one of those little blocks of postcard sized watercolor paper. And I wanted to try this out. Well, first, because I knew I wouldn't have any buckling. And secondly, because I wanted that slightly rougher texture underneath. I wanted to see how is that going to, what difference would that make? So, and I found out actually it did. It was actually very helpful. When I did my own drawing, it a little bit more of the Silverpoint actually stuck. So that was really useful. Then after that, I tried, and also I did another experiment, which I'll talk a little bit about further, where I did add some gum arabic into my ground. I was just curious to see if it made a difference. That was not a good idea. Adding the gum arabic to the ground actually made it slicker. So I think it'd be interesting to see how that works with the gouache, but I wouldn't put your gum arabic in with this pre-mixed ground. So here I'm just using, I think this was a piece of illustration board. So I thought I'd try that. Basically, all of these supports are ones that aren't necessarily going to buckle on me. And I could go back and after it was dry, put a second coating on if I wanted. And then lastly, I decided I would also go ahead and use some heavier watercolor paper. I had tried some thin watercolor paper the day before, and even though I taped it down, I had a bit of buckling, which didn't actually affect the paper once I cut it off the board. It flattened back out again. But this time I thought I would try a slightly heavier paper. And I did another version where I also taped that heavier watercolor paper just to a wood panel I had lying around, just using masking tape, and tried it that way. It turned out that all of these methods worked fine. Even, like I said, when I put the ground on the lighter watercolor paper, which I think was like a 90-pound, every single one of them worked. Every single one of them would take the paper. What the difference was mostly in the softness of the support. So in other words, where I had the harder, the thinner watercolor paper, it was more difficult to get the darker Silverpoint. Where I had the softer, thicker watercolor paper or the illustration paper or those little cards that were in the 3x5 type of squares, because those were all thicker, they took more of the stylus moving across it. They took more of the silver off. So that's just something to keep in mind. If you're using thinner paper, you can solve that by just having another sheet or two of paper behind. So all in all, that is all there is to actually applying the ground. You just let them dry for as long as is needed, and then go on and do some drawing. So this is just showing you how much buckling I got when I went ahead and used the lighter paper. But as I said, I just sort of cut the masking tape off the edge, and it was no problem. They lay flat for me to do the drawings. So because I'm taking a lot of time to show you all of these, but I think it's important to show you this information. I've got some images at the end that if we don't get time to draw in class, you'll be able to draw in your own time. But I just really want to show you all of these really quickly. So I went out in my garden and decided to draw some hollyhocks, just sitting out there in the blazing sun. First thing I found is that you want to have some shade over your drawing if you're drawing outside, because this is really light. And I decided to go for that sort of sketchy look. And then I was able to build up those darks just a little bit. You can see this is back indoors, but you can't get but so dark. However, I was happy with looking at those darks. And here's sort of the secret. What I did is I looked at these plants. I assessed every edge and I said, is this darker or lighter than the object it is next to? And then I used that to determine how much hatching needed to be done and what needed to be built up and not built up. So doing Silverpoint is very much, if you're going to do a drawing like this, is very much about controlling those values. In other words, assessing, is this leaf lighter or darker than the leaves around it? And then is that next leaf lighter or darker than the leaves around it, or this edge of the leaf, or whatever? Is the background darker? And would it help my leaf if I showed some dark background behind it to make my relatively white leaf stand out? So that really I started to get the hang of this. And so I went and did another hollyhocks, this time using the nickel and also the yellow brass, because I kind of wanted to see what would happen. It was a little easier to use the yellow brass than the nickel. It was a little harder for me to get the range. But I was starting to get the idea, as you can see here, how to regulate those strokes and that hatching to make those determinations about light and dark, and to have the dark of the stalk be shown because I hadn't made the leaves too dark. And this is just going to come with practice. I mean, I did so many practice practice drawings this week. And I think some of my clients would have probably preferred me spending more time on their stuff. But so here we have some examples of what I did with those little blocks. And over on the left, I had used the ground with the gum arabic. And like I said, it was a little slick. I wasn't so happy with that. I was much happier with the ground, just as it was, the golden ground with the silver. Just did a little bit of the washing on the line. But you can see here how this business of the dark next to the light is really important. That's what's going to make your drawings really work, especially as you're starting. And here's just an example looking up close. Now, this is a tiny little drawing, but I wanted to show you sort of how that sketchiness worked and how you kind of go back in and keep building up until you get a better dark. So over time, drawings done with silver point tarnish due to the effects of sulfur containing substances in the air. I, of course, was curious. I'm like, hey, I want my drawing to look like this. How am I going to make that happen? So I went online, and good old Google told me that sulfur was the deal. And then I read about somebody who had put their drawing in a little Tupperware with some chopped up hard-boiled eggs. And I said, for the sake of Summer of Drawing students, I'm going to see if that works. So what I did was I took eggs, chopped them up, taped one of the small drawings to the top of my Tupperware, and put that in overnight. And so what happened? You know, did it turn into a Rembrandt? And the answer is no, it did not. It turned into a slightly more brown version of what I had already. So it was an interesting experiment because it allowed me to see that sulfur really does make the difference. And if you're in a more humid area rather than a less humid, you'll probably find your drawings age faster. But what does it actually do? It just makes them more brown. It just tarnishes them. But it was an interesting experiment. I mean, really, art is all about chemistry, isn't it? So just to kind of recap some of this stuff, if we look at these beautiful drawings, what this is Giorgio Vasari was an artist, but also he wrote about art. And sort of his art histories are kind of one of the great books where we learn about how different artists worked back in time. And he had these pages that he put together of different artists' drawings, and then he made the little borders that go around each one of them. So these particular drawings here are 500, plus years old. So have they tarnished much darker than they were? No, they haven't. Their beauty is in their delicacy. And that's really sort of the message of silver point is the delicacy is key. And you'll see also that, mixing with the white, just that same two color idea that we've been talking about so often was really popular. So we've got time to draw. Thank goodness. Okay, we've got 15 minutes or so to draw. And what I would like you to do, we never got to the eye. This is Michelangelo's David's eye. And when we were doing the plaster cast the other week, we didn't get to the eye. In fact, I want to show you that in the PDF I'll also send you more clear images of the other body parts that we were talking about. But today we're just going to concentrate on the eye. And I'd like you to go ahead with whatever type of drawing media you're using to go ahead and start drawing this using hatching. Put a few lines down just to get yourself started. I'm not going to make you not do that. But see what you can manage to do with either your hard pencil or your silver point to start working on this drawing. Now, don't feel pressed by the 15 minutes because, as you can see, unless you really want to do that Rembrandt sketchy thing, which is perfectly fine. But if you're looking to really sort of say, well, how am I going to do this? It's going to take a little bit of time. You might actually even want to start with the eye and the eyeball rather than the overhang of the eyebrow, because what will happen if you start with the eyebrow, even though it's easy to see, and I'm always telling you to go for the darks first, et cetera, it will also suck you in to try to make things too dark too quickly. And I'm very interested in having you look at the form of the eye. So while you're drawing, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the form of the eye and for things for you to notice as you're drawing in the future. And the first thing I want you to notice is how the eyelid is like a very thick garage door that comes down over the eyeball, and it casts a shadow there on the eyeball. And that there are reflected lights that happen, light that reflects off the eyeball, back up underneath the eyelid, onto that rim, onto that shelf. And likewise, light that reflects on the top of the eyelid, the outside of the garage door, up onto the skin that overhangs underneath the eyebrow, so that along every one of these ridges, you can see some reflected light. In other words, the core of the shadow is not, it doesn't always run all the way down to the edge of whatever you're drawing. There's a little line of white, a little line of lighter skin, if it wasn't here on the plaster cast. And I really want you to notice that, because it's those little details, those that it applies to folds of fabric, as you'll see when we talk about folds of fabric in a little bit. But that reflected light and that feeling of form is really achieved by being able to show that the overhanging skin has some depth to it. It has some form itself. It doesn't just stop in a sharp line. And that because of that, because it does have some form, that anything underneath it reflects light up, and the core of the shadow is a little further up. You see it also in the overhang of the eyebrow, because if you look at that eyebrow and kind of squint a little bit, you'll see that there's sort of a sharper edge to where the overhanging flesh sort of meets the bottom of the eyebrow, and a sharper edge to where the top of the eyebrow kind of turns under. And because of that, you've got actually a darker shadow running in those two areas. And the reflected light from below, from the cheek surface that reflects up, is actually creating an area of light in the middle of that shadow. Once you start looking for these lights and darks within the shadow, now if you squint at this cast, you start to see all these wonderful lights within the shadow, that it isn't just as dark as we think of it normally when we're looking at it from a no-tan point of view. So this is good and bad. Seeing this stuff is good and bad. The good part is that when you are doing something close up like this, you'll get this sense of realism that starts coming in, and the sense of form, because you're starting to see all these different values. And once you get to control the values, making things darker and lighter as needed, going from all the way from those super darks to the super lights, you'll really get this wonderful sense. The negative of seeing all of this stuff in the shadows is that you get pulled in, you get sucked into doing all of that. And sometimes it then becomes difficult to control the entire value range. So if you find yourself not being able to really get, like your lights are getting too dark, or your darks are too light, or all your darks are too dark, or whatever, pull back and think of this from the no-tan point of view. Where are the major areas of dark and light? You want, when you stand back 3 feet from your drawing, you want to be able to see it in that sort of no-tan format, the design of the light and the dark. And then when you get up closer, to see the interesting details. So that's just something to consider as you're working on any one of these various different body parts, because you'll start to notice how the light from the skin reflects, say the cheek reflects on the side of the nose, the chin reflects on the bottom of the mouth, it goes on and on. Everything reflects on everything else. And you can really see it here in the turn of the form. So the reason why it's useful to use these plaster casts as something to draw from is, to begin with, color really isn't a key feature. Color is sort of taken out of the issue, and you can just concentrate on form itself. It's very good to be able to see how the anatomy of the eye actually works. When you're drawing somebody from a greater distance, you are rarely are you up this close to somebody drawing them. But when you're drawing them from a distance and you have an understanding of the mechanics, you can sort of look for how this works at a distance. at a distance, some of these darks are going to all sort of, those edges will get lost, just like the hair on Adriana the other week. Even here, you can see how that inner corner of the eye, just sort of the edge is lost as it goes into the shadow of the rest of the underneath the eyebrow like that. So the more you understand about how the anatomy works, the easier it'll be for you to draw really well when you're drawing figures later on. And using these sort of, this is sort of the closest you can kind of come in a sense to generic, is to take something that is a beautiful sculpture like this, try to duplicate it and learn from it how anatomy works. Now, this interesting little thingy that's going on in the middle of his eye for the pupil, that was done because, of course, Michelangelo knew that this sculpture was going to be viewed from the bottom, from a distance. The sculpture is way up on a plinth, and he needed to emulate that feeling of having a highlight and a dark next to each other as they are on the eye. And so this is just sort of a device that he used. Likewise, things on the ear, the nose, you're not really going, a sculptor isn't going to, drill the nasal passages in. He just wants to get that idea from the shadows of creating that illusion. So, some of that does play a part when it comes to working with these casts. So I did want to talk just a minute about imperfection and the beauty of imperfection. So while you're drawing, I'm just going to sort of finish up with a little bit of discussion about this. We've been talking a little bit today about craftsmanship and how, the digital images and filters and this, that, and the other keep pushing everybody to consider that the more airbrushed and the more beautiful and the more perfect is really what we're always after. And I think artists themselves in the non-commercial sort of realm are rebelling against that in various different ways, and always really have done, by extolling the virtues of the rough sketch, of the individual mark, the sort of the handwriting each artist has. You and each other person who is here today has a different way of approaching sketching, and that is your individual mark, and it's important. And just photoshopping that out does not lead to better artwork. So I think that really when you look at the world around you and you think, well, I'm going to draw what is beautiful, to a great extent, what you're also looking for is what is imperfect. There is beauty in that imperfection. And therefore, letterpress, for example, all those letters aren't as exact as the kerning if you just sat down and typed in Microsoft Word. But the imprint on the paper, the slight imperfections of how each letter is set in a row of text, that is what creates the beauty. And likewise, when you're doing something like Silverpoint, or you're trying to work in a very light manner of drawing, and you're getting frustrated, it's good to take a breath and not worry. If you don't like your drawing, fine, tear it up and off you go, start another one. But also, I think what happens is after you do a few, you start to go, hey, I understand how this one medium works. And I understand that what I'm drawing is perhaps not perfect. Maybe those leaves have holes in them, and that's fine. The bug ate them. That's part of nature. And once we start thinking like that about how we're working, and that we are craftspeople. I consider myself, I'm a painter, I'm an artist, I'm a craftsperson most of all. And sometimes I produce art, and sometimes I produce things, drawings, paintings, or whatever, that are just a product of my craft and a product of me practicing my craft. Takes a lot of the pressure off, not having to be an artiste. Now, often you'll find that curators and gallerists and critics, I'm always on about these folks, but they want us to be more mystical than that, and they want these works to be sort of everything is to be perfect all the time, because they can sell that, and they can sell the audience on that. And my feeling is very much the opposite. Beauty comes from being part of nature, not apart from it, not away from it on our computer screen. And that's why I'm always saying that, hey, working from photos, working from the computer images is great and fine. I do it all the time. But there's nothing like sitting out in your vegetable garden, like I was the other day, drawing my kind of ratty hollyhocks. It's my first year growing hollyhocks, and I just love them. The forms are really fantastic, and I'm looking forward to the flowers coming out. So That's just a message to take about drawing overall. We do tend to always think that, oh, I should look like Leonardo, or I should do this, that, and the other. And Silverpoint has more mysticism around it than probably every other drawing form. But, you know, to talk, for example, about the trois couleurs thing that we did last week. So I did a drawing of Adriana that I did not include in my video. And people have asked me, well, why? Where's that drawing? And it was because I'm not there yet. I did actually 3 drawings. And I haven't really shown many people the drawing that I didn't tear up. But it was it was not bad, and it's on its way, but I haven't yet hit that feeling, that I wanted a certain sort of classical sense, and a certain sort of economy of how much of the 3 colors I was using that I haven't achieved. And so I'm going to try again, and I'll probably try a few more times until I really start to get the feeling. So this will happen for you with Silverpoint also. I did find in my own sketches, I put way too much silver down to begin with, too much sketching, too much stuff going on. Took me maybe 6 or 7 different little sketches until I got there. So don't prepare yourself a big old piece of paper unless you're planning on cutting it up and doing lots of little sketches. You know, take it easy on yourself. All right, I'm going to just finish up for today. Like I said, these images will be available to you to work on your own time. All right, so just to wrap up, with modern materials, Silverpoint is really easy to try, but you keep your expectations in check about the value range and also about what tarnish will and won't do. Light lines and hatching, that's the way to go about this. You can establish your darker areas first, like we usually do, if you just want to sort of map out where the darker areas are, but just don't go super dark right away. You'll want to build up those areas over time as you assess where the lights and darks are in the rest of whatever it is you're drawing. Plan your moves, you know, sit there and have a look at it and go, okay, you know, I'm not going to go into the lightest part of someone's cheek and start hatching in there. I am going to regret it. And you can erase, you can definitely erase, but you want to keep it, it's a real myth that you can't do that. You just want to keep it to a minimum because you won't necessarily be able to go back as strongly over those areas later. And it's also really easy to prepare a number of surfaces quickly. I will say that nowadays there are also companies that are putting out pads of Silverpoint paper and that sort of thing already prepared. They tend to be a lighter paper. So if you are planning on sketching really hard or erasing, they don't necessarily hold up and they're kind of expensive. So for the price, I would recommend, you know, just preparing some supports yourself and seeing what happens. You might also want to just note on that support, maybe on the back of the paper or whatever, that you prepared it, because once you've put that ground on, it's hard to tell that whether that's one you prepared or not. So you might want to make some notes just so you know what's going on. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the screen. Okay, everybody, that is a wrap on Silverpoint, and I hope that's given you some information to get started with. I'm really looking forward to what we're going to do next week. We are going to do a deep dive into Florence goldsmiths, the art that they were putting together, how they used some of their drawings, but also what they created. And while we do that, I'm going to be reading a little bit from Benvenuto Cellini's autobiography. Now that sounds perhaps like it might be a little bit dull, but it is actually the opposite. Benvenuto Cellini was a rogue. He was a scoundrel, and he boasted about it in this autobiography he wrote. It is hilarious. It makes you want to go out and start, you know, sword fighting with your neighborhood artist, because that's what he spent most of his time doing, it sounds like. But he was an amazing goldsmith. We're going to learn more about him. We're going to draw from some of his works and other works using these same techniques to start to try to get some of this idea of subtle shading and stuff under control.